Hi, everyone. This is just a real quick introduction to the Black Death prior to our activity. And I do just want to warn you, some of the images that I'm using may be a little bit disturbing because the plague is still around today. And so I have some actual images to show you some of the things that plague can do to the body. If you feel like you might be squeamish in any way, shape, or form, you may just want to listen as opposed to watch this particular one. It won't be very long, as I said, but it's possible that these images could be considered disturbing by some. So Black Death, really we'll get into the origins of it first, and then we'll get into kind of the impact on Europe and how it relates, especially to our course. So origins starts with the Oriental rat flea, and this flea carries a bacteria known as Y. pestis or Yersinia pestis, and this is the plague bug. The rats that you so often hear about associated with the Black Death, these are going to be the hosts for the fleas, and so the fleas will live on the rats, and then the rats transfer those fleas to other hosts, humans included, and so then the disease can then be passed on to the humans. It can be passed on to cats and dogs as well, but then the fleas and the rats, they get a bit of a bad rap about all this. Modern historians and scientists believe that eventually the plague viruses, the plague bacteria, are able to evolve to the point where they're more easily communicable via humans. Otherwise, we wouldn't see the same dispersal methods that we see and how quickly it attacks different towns and cities across Europe. So it's interesting that even though we have this time period that's been incredibly studied, incredibly well studied, we're still learning new things and still making new hypotheses based on the evidence that's there. So 3 different types of plague actually are going to be during the Black Death time period, are going to be seen. We have the bubonic plague that affects the lymphatic system, and so the lymph nodes are where you're going to see the characteristic buboes appear. The septicemic that impacts the circulatory system, and then finally the pneumonic plague that is going to impact the lungs. So as I mentioned, 3 different types of plague. Septicemic was the rarest at the time. High fever, skin can turn dark color, and that's part of the idea of the Black Plague, the idea of it being black. Mortality rate is almost 100%. This one you typically didn't see all that often because people would die before they could pass it on to the next person. That's how quickly it attacked the body. Believe it or not, there is still no cure for the septicemic plague today. Here are some images. You can see the dates on there of septicemic plague and how it attacks the body. And it starts in the extremities and then develops out from there. No, that's not frostbite. That's actually septicemic plague. Pneumonic plague is the second most common. The symptoms included coughing, frequent coughing, flecks of blood in the saliva, flecks of blood being coughed up. Usually the symptoms would take 1 to 7 days to appear. That gives you the opportunity to pass that on before you die. The mortality rate was extremely high, 90 to 95%. And still people would die before they could transmit the disease just because they were so debilitated by the symptoms once they eventually hit. Here are some images of lungs that have been affected by the plague. If you want, pause this, you can read the information, but you can see within 48 hours and then 72 hours the way that the infection affects the lungs. You can see that information there, so if you're interested, feel free to pause it there. Bubonic is the most common form, and this is the one that typically is associated with the Black Death time period. Headache, vomiting, high fever, characteristic formation of buboes on the lymph node areas, the neck, the groin, the armpit, all of those areas tended to see those. And those buboes could be anywhere from, you'll see that, again, this is a modern picture here. This is one appearing on the lymph and the neck. Anywhere from, in some cases, marble size, at least at their outset, to we have record of tennis ball sized buboes appearing on the lymph areas. Could take 1 to 7 days to show the symptoms, and the mortality rate is lower, theoretically, 30 to 75% during that time frame. This is the one that was most easily passed on from person to person, meaning it's going to affect the most people. Today, the mortality rate is only about 10 to 15%. So if you were to get the bubonic plague today, you have a much better chance of living, in part because we're healthier overall from 800 years ago, but also because we're able to treat it a little bit more. Here we have some more modern images of those buboes forming on the lymph node areas. So here are the most common forms of plague, just some additional information. This is from a modern source. This is not from medieval age. And so it's important to remember that these things do happen. Typically, plague appears in areas of squalor, where there's very poor sanitation. That's where those infections tend to happen the most. There were just 2 cases recently in China. But now we're going to take a look at how it gets started in this time period. So most pandemics, most world epidemics of disease start in Asia. In part, it has to do with the way that the population is situated amongst a variety of other factors. The spread of the Black Death comes from the Tartars, at least initially, and Asian steppe people. And these people are traveling via the Silk Road. So we're seeing the impact of the Silk Road and the Mongolian Empire that allows them to travel to places like the Black Sea, which is where we're going to stop off next. And for this next part, to explain the story of how this all happens, I'm going to read from a source by a book from 1997 by an author named Corzine, and I'm just going to read directly from there because I think it's really helpful to hear the way that this whole thing shakes out. But before I do that, just a quick note. So this is the Black Sea area here. Here's Turkey, here's Greece, here's Italy over here. And we're taking a look at this peninsula here called Crimea, and specifically a city on that port called Kaffa. Now, during this time, this is kind of the jumping off point for all of the different Silk Roads that are going to make their way from here. And so it's a really popular area for trade. You have a great many different people. Thanks to the Crusades, we see more interaction than ever before in this region, and the advancements of the Middle Eastern cultures and the Asian cultures during this time frame mean that this is a highly populated, really popular area for trade. In there, here's the traditional story as it goes along with it, okay? According to a traditional story, the plague came to Europe from the town of Kaffa, a Crimean port on the Black Sea where Italian merchants from Genoa maintained a thriving trade center. The Crimea was inhabited by Tartars, a people of the steppe, a dry, treeless region of Central Asia. When the plague struck the area, meaning the steppe, in 1346, tens of thousands of Tartars died. Perhaps superstition caused the Muslim Tartars to blame their misfortune on the Christian Genoese, or perhaps a Christian and Muslim had become involved in a street brawl in Kaffa and the Tartars wanted revenge. In any case, the Tartars sent an army to attack Kaffa where the Genoese had fortified themselves. As the Tartars laid siege to Kaffa, plague struck their army and many died. The Tartars decided to share their suffering with the Genoese. They used huge catapults to lob the infected corpses of plague victims over the walls of Kaffa. As the Tartars had intended, the rotting corpses littered the streets and the plague quickly spread throughout the besieged city. The Genoese decided that they must flee. They boarded their galleys and set sail for Italy, carrying rats, fleas, and the Black Death with them. So, as these pandemics do, they travel by trade routes, initially here, getting it to the Black Sea area, and then from there you can see these arrows taking the plague off in different directions. What I really like about this map is that it gives you the dates and even the months that we start to see the plague hit. So if you want to pause and take a look, I think that's not a bad decision. This map gives you an idea of the spread of the bubonic plague, and it kind of moves in a C pattern. I'm not sure if my hand's going to go the right way. It might be opposite, but goes kind of like this. Starting at the bottom down here, where we mentioned, here's the Black Sea right over here, and then making its way south along these trade routes, and then finally up into the north. And you can see it spreads very, very quickly, starting in 1347 by the Black Sea and in certain spots in Italy, and then very quickly, within 2-3 years, spreading throughout the whole of the rest of Western Europe. There are a couple of places that do not or are not affected in the same way. Milan, we're going to talk about that in a minute. This region up here is pretty mountainous. This region up here doesn't have a super high population during that time frame. Again, just giving you an idea of some of these centralized cities and areas and when the plague hits them. It's just good to have in terms of the way that the plague spreads across Europe. Here, this is another one. This is a much more detailed map. I'd recommend you pausing the video and taking a look at this map here. How did they stop the Black Death? So there's an intense fear going on. People do not know. Germ theory is still hundreds of years away. We do not know how it's being spread. And so this fear permeates through everyone's lives. People are very suspicious of each other. And in Europe, what had been an increase in trade following the Crusades really comes to a standstill during this time frame. People thought all kinds of different things. use incense. The rotting corpses, how badly they smelled, they thought that maybe by using incense or different colored or different smelling flowers of some kind, it's the bad smells that are carrying these. And so they would use incense and sweet smelling things to try and ward off the plague. Bloodletting was used. We know bloodletting is still used for some certain things today. Leeches are still used, believe it or not. But bloodletting overall does weaken the body's ability to fight off infection. And so in some cases, this does more harm than good. Pope Clement VI at the time actually situates himself between two roaring fires in an effort to keep away the evil spirits, which God had caused to come down to earth for something that humanity did. Believe it or not, because the rats and fleas exist in dark, damp conditions, he is actually able to survive the Black Death, but not for the reasons he thought. In Milan, houses are quarantined as soon as family members are notified that they have the plague. In Venice, ships had to sit offshore for 2 weeks to make sure that they didn't show any signs of plague before allowing their goods to be unloaded. This is really why things matter to us. Feudalism is essentially dead in Western Europe thanks to the Black Death. There's a loss of people, and as we mentioned prior, in feudalism, everything had to work appropriately. So think about lopping off like a third of the people. Well, that whole system is going to topple over. The people who were left did not want to work, and so there's not enough food to go around for everybody. And this means that the agricultural industrial complex is going to fall apart. You're not going to be able to have these manors that are self-sufficient any longer because there's not enough people to work them. The lords then lose value. The lords aren't as important anymore. We already saw after the Crusades the development of monarchies, and these kings are becoming more powerful than ever before. Well, now the lords are losing their worth. The nobility is losing its worth because the lords are the ones running the manor. Well, if there's no one on the manor, do the lords really serve a purpose? And so the kings who are able to consolidate their land and keep all of their land together are able to gain even more power. And then we see a loss of skills. People actually, if you are working, you're probably doing what your father did and his father before him. Well, if everyone in a village who practices a certain skill, like tanning for leather, dies, well, that skill dies off with them. And so the manor can't function the way it used to. The people who are left are able to ask for more money than ever before, or at least more payment of some kind. People are paid exorbitant sums to transport dead bodies because nobody else will do the work. And so we have this sense of development in the lower classes that, hey, I'm worth something other than just what my lords and kings tell me I'm worth. The church is going to lose out in all of this. The church is losing power again to the kings as a result of the Crusades, but also here. The church makes promises, pray in a certain way, and you will be able to avoid the plague. Well, once that doesn't happen, people begin to lose confidence in the church. And as a result, people start to move away from the church dominating every aspect of their society. Across Europe, about a third to one half of the population died. And so the way that people deal with that is different. One defense mechanism is to kind of make jokes of it. And this is what people did. And this is something that we still do today. In uncomfortable situations, we might try to make a lighthearted joke so that you can feel above it. You don't sink into the despair of a particular situation. The art changes. Written language actually changes. Instead of being stylized and these themes of religion flowing within, it becomes very matter of fact. And we'll get to that more in a second. The tone of the language, the tone of the art changes. You have the development of this danse macabre, the presence of death, the presence of these skeletons dancing or running or playing or jumping. That permeates throughout art. Giovanni Boccaccio is an author during this time frame. He writes, I want to say from Venice, I believe, maybe Florence, and he keeps a diary. And this diary is then published, and his famous line is, plague victims would have lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors, because that's how quickly they die. He's a friend of Petrarch, whom we'll get to in the next unit, and he writes in the vernacular. He's not writing in Latin, he's writing in an Italian language, and that's going to play a major role in the spread of information. Children, yes, Ring Around the Rosie is kind of sort of about this, but more so why we care about this for kids. The birth rate actually drops, and the population drops so low and the birth rate drops so low, people don't want to bring kids in this environment or can't support them. It takes 400 years for the population of Europe to get back to the way it was. So the Black Death has an incredibly important role in European history, 1347-ish, getting into that transitional period right before the Renaissance. Thanks for listening and have a great day.